So this is, we've been going through, and unfortunately since last week, since I was ill, we missed a week, but not really. We started to look through each of the gospel accounts on what the gospel writers say who Jesus is, because that's what obviously Christmas is about. Christmas is about Jesus' birth, Jesus coming onto the earth, Emmanuel, God incarnate, God come with us. And it's the center point, it's the crux of Christianity, as you'll see in a little bit, that God would come to us and that God would give his own son's life for us. Christmas is the game changer of all of it. And so we have to ask ourselves, what does the Bible say? Who does the Bible say Jesus is? There's lots of titles to him. There's lots of names given to him. There's lots of stories written about him. And, it's really easy to just focus on Luke, the birth narrative. And I posted this week the Charlie Brown, Linus reading, saying it out loud. This is what Christmas is about. And I love it. It makes me cry every time I read that. And it is great and hear that. And it's sentimental and it's true. But that's not the full picture. Each gospel writer, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, present Jesus in a radically different way. And Mark does something unlike any other gospel writers. Most people believe that Mark, of all the gospels, was written first. And then Matthew, Luke, and John took their stories from there and worked from his text. And if you read the book of Mark, what's interesting about the book of Mark, he doesn't waste time. The book of Mark, if you read through it, which we may do in the new year, we're not going to do it tonight, obviously. The book of Mark is like an action-packed movie. Explosion after explosion, leap after leap, bound after bound. He uses the word immediately more than any other New Testament writer. Immediately this, immediately this, immediately this. Jesus is always on the move. There's a British writer and theologian from King's College in London, Burridge, and he says, he compares Mark, the Jesus in the book of Mark, to Aslan the lion. And he says he pounces like a lion. Jesus pounces on the scene here in Mark 1. There's no birth narrative. There's no little baby. There's no silent night. It's grown Jesus coming and getting baptized. And Mark gives us a really unique presentation of who Jesus is, but we have to know it, and it will shape and it will affect the way we look at Christmas. Although it's not the manger, and although it's not the stable, it's the lion pouncing. He'll come the way you least expect him, and when you least expect him. And if you remember from the Chronicles of Narnia, Aslan never comes the same way twice. And he never comes when everybody expects him to come. He comes on his terms. But when he comes, the world shakes. And everyone's rescued. Jesus is introduced in Mark different than any other one. It's not the Immaculate Conception. It's not the song. It's not the manger. Those are all warm and fuzzy. It's not even the light of the world, which we'll get to next week on Christmas, the way that John presents him. Mark launches into this raw Jesus, his character, his actions. And Mark uses this word wilderness 4 times. You should know that that's important. Mark doesn't waste words, and we think that he probably wasn't the most eloquent of all writers. So when he uses a word multiple times, that close together, in the wilderness, out to the wilderness, there's the wilderness, you have to understand what he's trying to drive home. Jesus is a king, and he's the God King come down, Mark would say. He's the Messiah, and you might say, duh. Hold on, I'll unpack that. But he's the Messiah who goes out into the wilderness. And if you don't meet him there, you'll never really meet him. The wilderness tells you everything about this king, that he goes out there so that you and me can go up there. And I didn't print an outline for you, but here, you follow it under 2 headings. I'll keep it simple tonight, just 2. If you want to know how Mark presents Jesus, here's how Mark wants you to see Jesus tonight. He wants you to see him as the God King come into man. And again, you might say, duh, of course Jesus is Christ. And if you come to church any number of years, or if you confess that and you're a Christian, you say, I know Jesus is Christ, but do you really? And what does it mean for you? And then how do you take it out of these doors and apply it? First, he's the God King, come down as man. He's the Christ, he's the Messiah, he's the anointed one. And then you have to know him not only as the God King, come down as man, but you have to meet him in the wilderness. First, know him as the Messiah. Mark uses this term in verse 1, Christos, which means anointed one. It means he's the King of all kings. This guy, not little baby Jesus. This is grown Jesus. We don't know how old exactly he is. But he's coming here, and John says that's him. He's the anointed one. He's God, but he's man. And that changes everything. He goes so far as he quotes Isaiah 40, and he says, make straight paths for him. Let me explain what that meant. It's actually a really profound statement. The way that if you were a king at the time, and you were victorious in battle, and you were coming home, you don't go through a mountainous region, partly because of danger and fear for your own life. People may attack you in the mountains. But also because it's highly inconvenient to take your entire force through a mountain cavern. You know what they did? They sent people ahead, and they said, make a road. And this was before, we had dynamite and cranes and everything to get rocks out. I mean, it's hard enough to make a road right now. I don't even know what goes into making a road right now. But I imagine it's pretty difficult. But at this time, could you imagine if somebody says, go ahead, make me a road so that it's smooth, so that its path is straight, so that I can go on it. Mark says, that's him. He's the king to end all kings. And you and I should go out and make a road for him. He's so to be honored. And John says, I'm the messenger. I'm the messenger of this man who's God. Now, again, I said, if you hear that, you may say, duh, I know, Jesus is the Christ, but wait a second. This is a term that you don't throw around lightly. And actually, Paul uses it in a little bit of a different way when Paul writes about Jesus. Mark says, no, he's the Christ. He's the one. Don't get it mistaken. He is fully God, and yet he stands right here in front of us. I want to point out how profound this would have been. Greek and Western religion at the time, they had lots of gods. They had a god for this, and a god for that, and a god for this, and a god for that. And if you wanted to go meet that god, you just go talk in the temple. If you want to go meet that god, you talk in the temple. Every god was incredibly personal, but infinitely limited. Certain gods were in charge of certain things, but no god was in charge of everything. Extremely personal, infinitely limited. But Eastern religions and Judaism believed that God was infinitely powerful, but completely impersonal. You couldn't even write his name or say his name, Yahweh. To this day, the Orthodox Jews wouldn't even write it out, the full name of Yahweh. It's that sacred. It's that untouchable. See? Western religion would say at the time, gods are incredibly personal. Pick your god, but they're infinitely limited. They don't do everything for you. Eastern religions and Judaism would say, no, God, there is one God, and he is incredibly powerful, but don't say his name. He's not yours. But Mark and the gospel writers, by saying that Jesus is the anointed one, they're saying, there's a man, and he's God. And that changes everything. And you and me in the year 2016 may be hearing that message and say, that doesn't really mean that much to me, but it would have blown the minds of people at this time. Jesus, the Messiah? Are you kidding me? That dude? What? And Mark says, yes. And you know the significance of it? It means that God becomes huggable. For the first time, no other worldview would tell you this. No other faith view would hold this, that the Lord of the universe, the one who created everything, would come down and you could hug him. You could sit at his feet. It's incredibly personal and incredibly powerful. Infinitely personal and infinitely powerful. This is the only one that says it. Mark says he's the Messiah. You know what it means? Here. If God becomes huggable, if God becomes touchable in the form of Jesus, he also becomes killable. He becomes murderable. He becomes something and someone that can take pain and that can take suffering. It also means this. If God would choose on Christmas morning to come into the form of a human, he must say that the human form is worthy. Hold on. What I mean by that is this. Our bodies, our lives, this world matters. Do you see? God says, I come into human form. I could have just said on Christmas morning, everybody come over here, come up here to heaven. No, he says, I come down. I'm huggable, I'm killable. Why? Because you're that special. Life is that special. Babies are that special. Humans are that special. Life is that precious, he would say. That's why he came down. That's what God incarnate means. God with us means that he cares about this place now. And if you press that out, and I will at the end of this message, it has vast and broad implications for you and me as a Christian, how we look at the world around us. It is broken and it is messy. But if he came down to be huggable, why can't we go out there to be huggable and vulnerable and touchable and heal and fix and mend. It means God cares about this body, about this life, and about this world. And he broke into it, cosmically speaking, to fix it. Not to start over. Not to say, oh, that's screwed up, get rid of it. He says, I'm going to come down there. And I'm going to work in that form to fix it. But if he works in this form, if he comes down in Jesus the Christ, the anointed one, he is man and he is God. That means he is God who is man, who can be killed, and he was on the cross. For you and me, he's infinitely personal. And he's infinitely powerful. No other God's going to offer you that. And it means in your most quiet of moments, you know what it means? It means you can go to him and say that, God, I know that you know what I'm going through. You're not up there pie in the sky, up high. I know you know, and I know you can fix it. But he's God the King, and I'm going through that point rather quickly because I want to spend more time on the last point. And it's something that I've overlooked as I preached on Mark many times. It's this whole business of the wilderness. It says that, it quotes Isaiah 40, and it says a person calling out in the wilderness, and it says John was out in the wilderness baptizing. And it says when Jesus is baptized, he gets driven out in the wilderness. In the wilderness, it says. And I don't know if you think of, how you think of wilderness. When I think of wilderness, I just think of a forest. I think of like trees and you're out camping. That's the wilderness, right? Wilderness camping. That's me, city boy. I think of it like, you just go out camping, there's trees. That's not this wilderness. This wilderness is the wild. It's desolate. It's barren. Actually, the Greek word used here is most often translated as complete and utter solitude. Let me read for you the definition of wilderness. Solitary, lonely, desolate, uninhabited. When it's used of places, it means a desert, wilderness, an uncultivated region, unfit for any pasturage. When it's used of persons, the dictionary says, it means deserted by others, deprived of the aid and protection of others, especially of friends, acquaintances, and kindred. Jesus is driven out in the wilderness. He's not the king who gets baptized and then marches triumphantly back into the city saying, look at me, I'm fresh and clean. The minute he's baptized, the Spirit says, go out there where the wild things are, and you will be alone. You will be in an uninhabited region. Nothing grows. Why? He goes out to the wilderness so that you and me, in our times of wilderness, know there's no wilderness that will ever kill us. Do you see this? I know that you go through your wilderness times, and I know you go through your dry times, and you feel like nothing's growing in your life. This is the only God who says, I know, because I went out there, and I was tempted, and I was with the beast, and nobody came for me. This king going to the wilderness on Christmas morning means everything for you and me. There's a poem that I mentioned a while ago, and it's one of my favorite poems, and I didn't do it justice when I think when I quoted this before, and it's my old boy, Eliot. I call him Eliot. We're boys. He's T.S. Eliot to you. To me, he's just Eliot. He has this poem called The Wasteland. And he summarizes this, and this is not, he's not intending this, I'm not reading that at all, but he does, it is closely parallel to Isaiah when you read this, about this wilderness and this desolation and the suffering servant who would go out into the wilderness. And he says this, he writes, what are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish, son of man? You cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images where the sun beats and the dead tree gives no shelter. The cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water, only there is shadow under this red rock. Come in under the shadow of this red rock, and I will show you something different from either your shadow at morning striding behind you, or your shadow at evening rising to meet you. You know what he's saying? Jesus says, I'm the red rock. If you're in your wilderness, come under me, you will find no shade otherwise. And if you go under that red rock, the rock that was bleeding, Jesus himself, you know what you find, T.S. Eliot says? He says, your shadow at morning striding behind you, meaning all the things you fear that are chasing you. And he says, you will neither see that nor your shadow at evening rising to meet you. All the worries and the things that are worrying you in your life right now. He says, neither the shadows behind you nor the shadows before you will haunt you anymore if you come under this red rock. See, he writes, it's a desolate place. Out of the stony rubbish, son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you only know a heap of broken images. And here's the thing. How does this apply to you? Like I said, many of you and I have gone through wilderness times. You've gone through the times in your life where it says it's completely desolate. I feel completely alone. Nothing's growing and nothing's looking good. The sun's beating down on me and it hurts. Now, if you have a friend who comes to you and says, me too. Me too. That's the best kind of friend you're ever going to have in your times of wilderness. See, if you go through a wilderness period in your life and you have somebody who comes and says, well, the Bible says, here's what you do about wilderness, you're going to go stuff it. Get away. Or if you have somebody who comes and says, listen, just, fix your problems, be happy, smile, marry up, pray more, you're going to punch them in the face. Hopefully you do. But if you have a friend who says, me too. I've been in that wilderness. I've seen the heap of broken images. I've been under the dead tree that gives no shelter. Do you see now that this is Jesus for you? He's the friend of all friends who comes to you and says, your wilderness, I know. It's not going to be easy. The sun will be down on you, and you will be overmired in a heap of broken images and sadness, and the shadows will chase you from behind you, and the shadows will worry you in the future. But come under the red rock, and I'll give you shadow. Does a king come as a man to say, I care? This is a king who was out in the wilderness to say, I know. Come under my red rock. Now, how do you get this? How do you get to this point? Here's what it is. Mark's a rather interesting book. He doesn't really repeat himself many times, but in Mark 1, he starts off the narrative of Jesus with what? Jesus' baptism. If you notice, if you look back at your translations, he says, when Jesus is baptized, the heavens what? Tear open. These aren't clouds just softly parting. This isn't like the sun just breaking through. He says the heavens ripped open. It's actually the Greek word schizo, which is where we get our word schizophrenic. Split, ripped, torn asunder. He says when Jesus is baptized, the heavens rip. And the only other time Mark uses that word, and the only other time the next time Mark talks about the baptism of Jesus, you know what it is? It comes in chapter 10, verse 38. And Mark is talking to a couple people. Jesus is talking to a couple people. And he says, can you be baptized with the baptism I was baptized with? And he's talking about what? His death. See, when he's baptized at the beginning, it looks like a good, happy ending story, doesn't it? Oh, the heavens open and the dove comes down. No, it's ripped. Why? Because his baptism will lead to his ultimate baptism as a baptism of death. Why? Death for you, death for me. There's no coincidence that on the cross, Mark's the only one who says that when Jesus was on the cross, he uses that word schizo again. The curtain in the temple was schizoed. It was torn. See the parallel? It's like bookends. Mark 1 says he's baptized and the heavens tear open. Mark later on says he's on the cross and the veil is torn open. It's ripped, not lightly cut with little scissors, torn, so that you and me get to go to the Holy of Holies, the place no one got to go. You see what God incarnate, you see what Emmanuel means now? Infinitely huggable, infinitely killable, infinitely touchable. He says, you have me now. That veil that may have kept you from God has been torn on the cross, and it starts when Jesus is baptized. It starts, if you will, on Christmas when he comes into the world. He cosmically tears a hole and says, I'm coming. And you'll need to see me come as a man to know that I care. But you'll need to meet me in the wilderness to know that I know. There's no coincidence, by the way, as a side note, that if you look through the Old Testament and much of the Bible, that almost every place that God really meets his people is where? In the wilderness. Moses and the people in the wilderness. He wrestles in the wilderness. His people always meet him in the wilderness as a way to say this: if you want to know God, go to the wilderness. Go to the depths in your heart. Go to the places. It's most often in the wilderness that God's saying, I'm here. And you don't have to, you can't, if you want to trust me, if you want to know how I'm here in your wilderness, if you want to know how I'm here in your heap of broken images, look at Mark 1. My son was driven out so that you can be brought in. God's drawn near to us. Interestingly enough, the wilderness too. The wilderness is a metaphor. If you look at it, you can't. What's the wilderness? It's dry, nothing grows. You can't survive without help. On Christmas, God says, I am that help. And in your dry times, and in the times where the sun's beating down on you, you think you don't know where to go, and your shadows are chasing you, or your shadows are before you, nothing will give you help. Nothing will give you manna or water from the rock. You know how they got saved in the wilderness all the time, God's people? Because he helped them. And you know how you and me get saved this side of the cross? Because Jesus died for us. Jesus gets thorns in the wilderness. He gets thorns. That's what the wilderness has. It has nothing but thorns, cacti, and things that hurt, scorpions that pierce you. He got it. So that you know, not as a little pep talk. I'm not giving you inspiration today. I'm giving you the gospel. I'm not saying that when you go through the wilderness, just smile and be happy because Jesus did it. Trust and obey because there's no other way. No. Meditate on the fact that he suffered in the wilderness. So that when you go through your wilderness, you know this wilderness will not bleed me dry. It can't. Because he already bled dry on the cross for me. He experienced the ultimate wilderness, hell, and yet he rose. What wilderness then can you not come through? He's the God King, come as man. He says, I'm huggable, but I'm killable. I'll be vulnerable for you. Meet me in the wilderness whenever you doubt me. Know that I suffered infinitely more than you ever have to suffer. Now, as I conclude, what does this mean? Let's make it very practical. What does it mean that the God King has come as a man? It means this: the body and the world matter. You and I should fight injustice, poverty, racism, hatred. We don't turn a blind eye to those and say, oh, we'll just go to heaven, hide high in the sky. No, we say if God came down to the earth, then he cares about this place. He'll restore it. Now I have to start restoring it now and be part of that process. It's called redemption. It starts on Christmas morning and on the cross and when he rises on Easter. And he says, this world matters. And I came in human form to tell you that it matters. Secondly, what does it mean that he goes into the wilderness? It means that you and I, and listen to this, you and I as Christians, or Christians in general, should have the ultimate and only answer for suffering. I don't have time to unpack this because we only have a few minutes and I know it's a big topic. Why do people suffer? Why do innocent people have to suffer and die? Why is there injustice? Why is there poverty? Why is there hatred in the world? And it's a big question, and I don't pretend to answer tonight. But you and I, knowing that the King went out into the wilderness for us, we have finally one answer for it. Because he's the only God who knows true suffering. He doesn't just say, I'll fix suffering. He says, I'll experience it. So that you know when you suffer, and when you see suffering, why do you cry? Because something in your heart is pointing back to the ultimate story. Why do you pain when you see suffering in other people's lives? Because you know there was one who suffered ultimately. The gospel frees you and me. This is good news, Mark says. He doesn't say it's a good rule book. He doesn't say it's a good self-help guide. He starts off his letter by saying, this is the good news. It's news for you and me, that he would come in human form to be vulnerable and killable, and he was. But yet that he would go out in the wilderness to take the pains and the slings and the arrows that you and I never have to take. The gospel frees us from ourselves. It frees us from the shadows behind and the shadows before. There is shadow under this red rock. Come in under the shadow of this red rock, and I will show you something different, either from your shadow at the morning striding behind you, or your shadow at evening rising to meet you. How do you respond to this? This isn't the warm and fuzzy Christmas story, I know. It's the King who suffers in the wilderness. Just know this: he did it for you. Therefore, no wilderness will ever engulf you. It can't. That's good news. With that, I'm going to ask Dennis, I'm going to put him on the spot to come up as we do the Lord's Supper. I'm going to ask you to pray, but I'm going to ask Dennis, instead of Melody playing, I'm going to ask Dennis to lead us, just to play the song, not to sing it, just the last song, It Is Well With My Soul. Because if you know that he did experience the wilderness, then you'll come to this table and you'll say, it is well with my soul. And we take this table each month here at Soul Grace as a celebration to know that he took the thorns and the arrows and the slings and everything for us. He took death very much for us. If that's true for you this evening, come take this element. This is his blood. This is his body poured out for you. If it's not true this evening, take a moment, pray, ask. On Christmas morning, he's so much more than a baby. He's the God King come as a man to die. And he did for you. Pray over that. Go in prayer now, and then I'll lead us as we take these elements. Actually, what I'll do is I'll have you take the elements now. Come forward, take them back to your seat, meditate on it, pray for a while, listen to as Dennis plays, and then we'll take this as a community all together.